Discussant. So I'd like to welcome all of you to this workshop, the Perils and Promises of African Nationalism, a workshop held in honor of Amilcar Cabral on the 40th anniversary of his assassination. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris. I'm a grad student here at York University and one of the co-organizers of this workshop. What I'd like to begin by is just explaining the genesis for this project, the rationale behind it, what we're hoping to achieve by holding this today. The idea for the workshop began with conversations among some of the co-organizers about the ways in which nationalism is typically discussed and the way that it tends to be either a kind of celebratory form of hero worshipping or a kind of overly pessimistic portrayal of nationalism in the post-colonial period and the sort of decline into neocolonialism. And while we're cognizant of both of these perils and promises, we're hoping to expand the discussion beyond these dichotomies and open up a wider range of conversation between different generations of scholars, interdisciplinary scholars, and across a range of geographies as well. So we're trying to address some interconnected questions, and the first of them is they reflect the panels that we'll have today. The first is, how has the Pan-African imagination been shaped by and in turn shaped the outlook of scholars and struggles past and present? What has been the fate of various African nationalist projects and how have they influenced post-colonial struggles today? And finally, how can Cabral's revolutionary thought and praxis assist us in understanding the promises and perils of African nationalism? So the program for today, which you have in your little leaflets, is as follows. We'll begin by having our first panel that'll take us to 11:30, and that's on the thought and praxis of Amilcar Cabral. We'll break for lunch from 11:30 to 12:30, and then following that we'll have our second panel on Pan-African thought and the international dimension, 12:30 to 2:30. We'll break for coffee after that. Our third panel will then take us to 4:45. We'll have a final coffee break, and then wrap things up with our concluding remarks from two of our speakers who will give a synthesis and reflection on some of the themes that we've heard today. And then for those of you with endurance and those of you that can make it through the day, we're gathering afterwards at Perils Restaurant and Lounge, which is at 812 Bloor Street West. You can ask myself and some of the other co-organizers for directions. It's pretty close to Ossington subway station. We're gathering there afterwards just to have some food, some drinks, reflect on the day. And finally, none of this would be possible without the other co-organizers of this event, so I'd like to thank Alex, Pablo, and Santim for all of their hard work in putting this together. So let's just give them a round of applause. And of course, financial support is always welcome for things like this, so I'd like to thank the Political Science Department, the Anthropology Department, African Studies, the History Department, the Graduate Program in Social Political Thought, the Graduate and Undergrad Program in Development Studies, the Graduate Student Association, the Office of the Master here at Founders College, the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, and the Harriet Tubman Institute. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first panel for the day with Alex Caramento as the chair discussant.
Hi, good morning. So I'll just perhaps premise the discussion first with just a general introduction and some questions I pose to the panelists. And then I'll introduce each of the speakers and they can proceed to, I guess, give their presentations. So as both a theoretician and practitioner of national liberation, Cabral sought to understand and overcome Portuguese colonialism and African underdevelopment. The main question put before this panel is, how can Cabral's revolutionary thought and praxis assist us in understanding the promises and perils of African nationalism? So a series of supplementary questions were posed to the panelists. They don't have to answer them directly, but perhaps it just sort of helps frame the debate or the discussion. So firstly, what distinguished Cabral's revolutionary nationalism and Luso-African nationalism more generally from other variants of African nationalism? Is Cabral's non-static and materialist understanding of culture appropriate and or useful for analyzing post-colonial African societies? Thirdly, drawing upon both his theoretical contributions and PAGIC/FARP's operations in liberated zones of colonial Guinea-Bissau, what would genuine national liberation entail for Cabral? Fourthly, why did the native petty bourgeoisie of Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and Southern Africa, i.e. those colonies that experienced armed liberation struggles, fail to commit what he said called class suicide or re-Africanize was Cabral correct, considering the circumstances Paget confronted in assigning this class, or a militant fraction of this class, as his revolutionary vanguard? And then finally, fifthly, many tend to uncritically celebrate or overemphasize Cabral's successes and accomplishments. What were some of his shortcomings as a theoretician and leader of Paget's national liberation struggle? So it's my hope that the following presentations and subsequent discussion will assist us in answering these questions and allow us to fully appreciate the theoretical and practical legacies of Amilcar Cabral. Each of our panelists will be afforded no more than 25 minutes to speak. I will indicate to each panelist when they have reached the 20-minute mark, 5 minutes left, and the 23-minute mark, 2 minutes left. During the subsequent discussion, I kindly ask that the audience keep their questions or comments to no more than 3 or 4 minutes in length, so we get as many questions in as possible, right? So from my left to right, Pablo Idahosa is a professor in the Department of Social Science at York University, where he was formerly the director of African Studies program and is now the director of the graduate program in Development Studies. He has written on development ethics, African political thought, the politics of ethnicity, and globalization and development. He is author of The Populist Dimension of African Political Thought, co-editor of The Somali Diaspora, and co-editor of Developments, Displacements, Economies, Ecologies, and Cultures at Risk. Deirdre Meintel is professor of anthropology at Université de Montreal. She also co-directs, or rather directs, a research group called Université Urbaine and edits a journal of the same name. Along with a colleague, she also directs an Inter-University Center for Ethnic Studies, CETUM. She has long worked on issues around ethnicity and migration. Since 2006, she has been directing a broad research team studying contemporary religions and spiritualities in Quebec. And she has published extensively on Cape Verde, including a book, Race, Culture, and Portuguese Colonialism in Cabo Verde. Mustafah Dhada is professor of African and Middle Eastern history at California State University Bakersfield campus, a graduate from Oxford, a Fulbrighter, fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society. He is author of numerous scholarly works on Lusophone anti-colonial history, including the critically acclaimed Warriors at Work. He is currently completing a monograph on the Wiriamu massacre of 1972 in Mozambique during the national struggle. And finally, David Austin is professor in the Department of Humanities at John Abbott College and co-founder of the Alfie Roberts Institute in Montreal, Quebec. He is author of numerous scholarly works on the Black radical tradition of Montreal and Pan-African thought. He is editor of You Don't Play with Revolution, the Montreal Lectures of C.L.R. James, and is author of the forthcoming book, Fear of a Black Nation, Race, Sex, and Security in 60s Montreal, which will be published by Between the Lines Press later this year. I guess Pablo.
Okay, I'm going to stand up so I can make sure people can see me, as small as I am. One of the benefits, and I think pitfalls, if you can use a feminist expression, of utilizing Cabral for the purposes of trying to reframe various aspects of Africa, it can be a tendency towards a certain kind of hagiography and a certain kind of exegesis of his oeuvre and of his life. And I don't think you can separate either things. I think the biography of Cabral is really significant and important to something I want to talk a little bit about later, which is, I think, essential to discussions and debates that are currently being had in Africa around the state, but more specifically leadership, and the kind of quality and style of leadership that informs the state, that characterizes the institutions, and therefore the nature of a certain kind of development that exists in Africa today. But before I do that, I just want to, and I think it's significant that, in a sense, we're at this moment of, in a sense, 3 key people of Africa in the diaspora were killed around this time. The first being, of course, Cabral, the second being Lumumba, and the third being, of course, Martin Luther King. And so we're talking about 3 people who were crucial to movements that saw certain kinds of liberation and saw certain kinds of justice. And in a sense, the quality, and I think it's important to emphasize, is the quality of life of the people whom they were seeking to lead. And I was struck by a comment by Joseph Kizerbo, who, for those who don't know, is a Burkina historian and one of the editors of the the Cambridge History of Africa, who was in Conakry when Cabral's funeral was taking place. And he saw the bullet in Cabral's body, and at that moment, he was part of a delegation, pointed to the fact that what an enormous loss that this was, not just for Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde, but also for Africa as well. And so the question is, well, what are the reasons for that? So if we're thinking about questions that are part of rethinking about the promise of nationalism, leadership was certainly part of it. Or we might say the absence of leadership was a part of that. And I say this as well because leadership has a certain kind of currency in mainstream development discourse today. Much of it very, very instrumental. Much of it about economic growth, for example. Recently, there was a book that was brought out by the World Bank, amongst other people, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Australian Development Institution, and so on. And it's called Leadership and Growth. And lo and behold, there are 3 pieces in there that talk about the problems of leadership. And lo and behold, one of the people cite is Amilcar Cabral. So you know there are problems when the World Bank discovers Amilcar Cabral. But nonetheless, it's part of a engagement with, of course, what people understand and conceive of one of the major failings and problems. So whether it's mainstream institutions who've been part of the problem of Africa, of course, or whether it's people on the left for whom leadership has a kind of an uneasy quality, and I'll get to that in a moment, because it smacks of hierarchy, it smacks of those who lead, and rather than those who should lead, who should come from below. So I'd like to talk a bit about that, and I'd like us to have a discussion about it as well. So one of the elements of Cabral's quality as a leader, and I think why one should engage it with debates, if you want to use the expression, which are counter-hegemonic of the mainstream debates about leadership and leadership qualities, which I say are all about linking certain kinds of moral dispositions and personalities to institutions that work. And of course we know that when mainstream discourse or development discourse does this, it's really about making markets function, making property work as well as it should in terms of markets, and less really about the quality of lives, although that's a residual notion in mainstream ideas about development. So to get back to this notion that Cabral, in a sense, is a person whom we sometimes, I think, over-deify, if one can use that expression, but also engage in this hagiography and exegesis around his work. And it's easy to do that, in part because, of course, there are a lot of wonderful titles and a lot of expressions that Cabral uses, on top of course, his main works. The Weapon of Theory. I mean, it's a great. I mean, you know, wouldn't we all have wanted to say that, right? You know, the Weapon of Theory. Obviously used in the context of armed struggle, and obviously having these kind of Maoist overtones, but nonetheless, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. Now I think that's part of Cabral's biography, but I also think it's part of a disposition around leadership, which I'll get to in a moment. Unity and Struggle, obviously, right? The compendium, which, like a lot of his work, you can draw from and identify some valuable insights as well as useful kind of theory. And then there are those specific pieces, like a brief analysis of the class structure of Guinea, which I think is still a gem, despite some of the criticisms that people like Cabral and others have had of the work itself. But therein, I think, lies part of the quality of leadership. And it has to do with Cabral's biography. And why is that the case? Well, why that's the case is that I've said on many occasions that he was lucky, if you can put it in this sense, that he had access to a countryside and a place over a long period of time to do a real ethnography, not the ethnography of our students who spend 3 months in a place and call it ethnography, but rather a genuine ethnography of spending a long time with populations and trying to figure out and understand the nature of the communities and the societies and the leaders in those societies and communities. Now, he was doing demography. He was trying to find out, in effect, the relationship between demography and food. But of course, he used it for other reasons. It gave him an opportunity to actually find out something about the peoples. Not the abstract people of the populations of parliamentary democracy that we do polls on and do surveys on to try to find out what's the best way in which we can mobilize them to vote for our party. But to try to understand, again using that wonderful expression he uses, not just tell no lies, claim no easy victories, but also this notion that he has, that we need to understand what people are fighting for. Now, we can use fighting as a metaphor, or we can use it literally. We can use it the sense of which people pick up arms and go to fight against the colonial oppressors, or we can use it as a metaphor to say people are struggling to get a better life, to have food, to do the things, the real material things, that it seems to me that are part of the everyday lives of ordinary Africans today as well. So as a piece of distilling something from Cabral, that hasn't lost its resonance at all. It's still there. But that quality of leadership, of course, comes from someone who really was disposed over a long period of time to understand the nature of the communities that he was told to observe in order to understand the nature of their food production. And it was an opportunity, and it was something, of course, that he both benefited from, but he also utilized. But it also afforded him the opportunity, of course, to actually visit people, to listen to people, to see people in their productive environments, and to see the ways in which they were both constrained, coerced, exploited, how they were, in a sense, consensualized to produce both by the Portuguese state, but also by local leaders as well. In other words, to try to understand the material culture of populations that he was working within. And it seems to me very few leaders have that opportunity, both as a vehicle for utilization, because it's part of a program of struggling against those who would exploit those populations, but also as a way of understanding culture. Again, one of the key terms in Cabral. And again, I don't want to monopolize the discussion and debate. Hopefully that'll be ongoing. But one of the things that Cabral did, and one of the things that we all should try to claim, and is that Cabral was about differentiation, both in not fixing and homogenizing culture, quite the contrary, right? Rather, he differentiated culture, and to do that, once again, you had to understand the local. You had to understand leadership. You had to understand everyone from the Cadiz to the local Ogas, as well as to the more decentralized forms of authority and power that existed in Guinea. Cabo Verde was slightly different for obvious reasons, because it was a different set of circumstances. But my point is that experience, both in his own world of Cabo Verde growing up, but also that research experience, right, allowed him an opportunity to really get a handle on culture, not in the homogenized way that we often use the term, not in the way in which it's invoked often, as I say, as part of the grad student syndrome component of research, but rather, forgiving me and all the grad students here, it wasn't a project, to use an undergraduate student term, right? It was a project, but it was of a very, very different kind. It had a means-end aspect to it. So obviously, Cabral then had a dispositional, what I call a dispositional form of leadership. He was, obviously came from a petty bourgeois family. By the way, I visited his house recently. It was definitely petty bourgeois. We'll talk about that informally in a moment. Overlooking, by the way, a place that had a lot of slave revolts, which is not accidental, I don't think, in terms of Cabral's own formation. But all that said, so one of the questions then is that I have, and I will make no claim to answer, but I want to throw it out there as part of a conversation and discussion that we have, is the kind of work that Cabral was doing for a very specific purpose, right, which was to understand how to mobilize, as he would put it, as a physical force, the peasantries in the societies that he was seeking to mobilize for purposes of national liberation. Is that kind of knowledge, is that kind of information valuable for purposes of contemporary Africa? Now, I have a short and longer answer. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is, of course, it's complicated. But the other facet of this is that Cabral was interested in figuring out who to go to, who to talk to, whom to seek advice from. But he was also seeking to lead. Right? It wasn't just a matter of getting information, again, to use the language of modern development studies, or a lot of people in post-development, to do it from below. It's clear that the party was about doing it from within, but from above. And to do that, you required strong leadership. The question is, once again, is what is the quality of this leadership? And I want to have a brief pause moment, and in a sense, have a discussion with all of us about what I would, again, to use my cliche, our dispositional approach to leadership, particularly, I think, on the left, which is linked to this visceral response to looking at communities and societies, understanding their needs, understanding their pain, understanding the multiple forms of oppression they experience, but at the same time having an empathy with them that elides really these other features of leadership, which involve hierarchy, which involve forms of administrative rule. I almost caught myself that by saying law. But which are sometimes are decentered in a way in which I think Cabral knew was not possible. Right? In other words, if you want a state build and you want to bring about not the class suicide, which I don't think he ever expected the petty bourgeoisie to actually take place, but for them to have an affinity with populations such that they are able and enabled to lead. So much of the kind of decentering and what I might call the social movementism of the 90s, which was understandable in light of the failure of a great deal of the states, for whatever sets of reasons, and to which a great many people, including people on the left, found their affinities with, in a sense, I think removes a great deal of the legacy of what, if I can say this, I'm not in his head, I'm not his biographer, and I certainly don't want to have the last word on this, and that's why this is a conversation and a debate. But nonetheless, I think that we can say he realized that there needed to be, and the model that he had, of course, not just the Nationalist Party, but the party he had was one of centralized authority and rule with forms of democracy that came from within. And I say that in part because, again, Cabral had certain kind of advantages which subsequent nationalist leaders, which previous nationalist leaders didn't have. One was, of course, the very brief but recent historical record of Africa from the 1950s up until the 1970s and late 60s when he was struggling for independence. And that had to do, of course, with the fragmentation of a great many of African states and a great many African political parties that fragmented along ethnic lines. And so the one-party state, I'm not justifying the one-party state, but what I am suggesting is that it was a model of a certain kind of democratic leadership. That the one-party state, to which he said on many occasions, is an appropriate site and vehicle and institution through which, for some period of time, would be a justifiable way of going. So, but Cabral is fundamentally someone who doesn't look at leadership in of itself, but looks at it and uses, again, his famous expression about the petty bourgeoisie. It was a leadership that necessarily, given the circumstances of Africa in the 1960s and 70s, that would require the petty bourgeoisie to be at the heart of leading the state. So his analysis then combined, obviously, an anti-imperial analysis with a class analysis. Oh, 5 minutes. Okay. I'll do my flute playing and be quick. All right. All right. Let me bring these things together. Let me summarize what I was going to say. We've moved a long way from the late 1960s to the middle 1970s, and obviously classes and institutions have changed enormously since Cabral's time. So has the nature of imperialism. So Cabral was concerned at the same time he had this ambivalence about the petty bourgeoisie because he'd seen what had been taking place in Africa. He'd seen the early phases of this kind of aggrandizement of a kind of a neocolonial would-be bourgeoisie, if we can use Fanon's expressions, and hoped that there would be some sense of service that members of the petty bourgeoisie could bring about in order not to draw upon the lessons of the early 60s and early 70s that had been elsewhere in Africa. And it seems to me that analysis can no longer be with us, right? In the sense in which classes have been transformed enormously in Africa today. But nonetheless, I think that the broader issue of the kinds of leadership that Cabral was talking about in relation to what I would call understanding the populations that you are meant to lead is still with us today. The poverty of leadership, to use the expression that Ngugu first initiated, is a leadership without vision, a leadership without a sense of the direction and purpose that African states should go. I think that the political imagination of Cabral, who was long before his time over a whole range of issues, pushes us to really think about how we would understand leadership in the contemporary conjuncture, in this transition moment when new classes are being formed in Africa, that there are new attempts at state building or restate building in the context of a number of failed nationalism, but also what we might call the ongoing nationalisms. Nationalism hasn't stopped in Africa, right? So to use the expression, which for those of you who don't know Portuguese, and nor do I very well either, it's about trying to understand the locality of and the circumstances and context of any given country. And this is, I think, one of the dilemmas of Cabral. On the one hand, he's very specific about the place that he's arguing out of, but then he has this generalizable argument about the nature of imperialism and class and state in Africa today. So it seems to me that if we want to take Cabral seriously, we need to have a stronger sense of leadership within the context of states that are undergoing these enormous transitions in Africa, and which at the same time don't devolve into analysis which is rooted in just the local, only the contingent of the local, but at the same time understanding the local itself. So I'll leave it there, and we'll hopefully have a discussion about this. Thank you.
Culture and process in Cabral's political thought, but specifically as it applies to the reality that I saw in Cape Verde in the colonial period, because I did my doctoral fieldwork there in 1972. And I first, though, wanted to say how happy I was to see that this occasion was taking place. I'm here as much to learn as anything else, because I'm not a political scientist or specialist of Cabral, and I hesitated even before accepting the invitation, thinking, what do I have to say? But at the same time, I thought that the circumstances under which I even first heard of Cabral are probably interesting for today's young scholars and probably rather exotic as well. So I was a student, and I left in late '71 for Cape Verde from the United States. I was a student at Brown University, and I was at that point interested in studying Cape Verdean migration, and especially the reasons for the migration to the States. And I wanted to see how race functioned in Cape Verde, because I knew something about the Cape Verdean American community in the States, which was a bit separate from American blacks and also, of course, excluded by whites. So I wanted to better understand the background of the Cape Verdean Americans. I didn't encounter Cabral's writings until I left Cape Verde in late '72, but it was very exciting to me because of his stature as leader of the revolution, but also because of his sociological understanding of Cape Verdean society. And that's what I want to talk about, how really, in a way, follows up with what you were saying, and how accurate he was in that. And and secondly, I am also amazed at how contemporary some of his thinking still is, and how much it applies to contexts even far from Africa. Like I see some aspects in Quebec, where I've been living for a long time now. I live in Montreal. And then, some of the work today being done on culture and identity, I see echoes of Cabral. But at the same time, and towards the end, and to avoid hagiography, it is amazing also how spectacularly he misjudged the possibility of union between Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau. So I'll try to say something about that in the last part of the paper. So the first inklings of what I would find in Cape Verde began with some encounters I had in Providence with a new immigrant who seemed to want to know a lot about my political orientation, what books did I read, and so on. And I later found out that this individual was one of several agents of the Portuguese security police working in the Cape Verdean community in New England. Then the difficulty of getting a visa to stay in Cape Verde, a research visa, and indeed when I finally did, after numerous efforts, and basically through the good offices of a man well known in the immigrant community, who actually frankly was a fascist, but in any case I owed the visa to him basically. So this was the build-up, and then I got to Lisbon, and when I mentioned where I was going, the airline personnel got a panicked look on their face and would run into the back room to make a phone call. So this gives an idea of how controlled were contacts between Cape Verde and the outside world. As for Guinea-Bissau, I was just saying to Mustafah that my only contact with Guinea-Bissau was on my way out in a very hot room in the airport with armed guards with guns drawn at the doors, and that was all that I got to see. The movement was very controlled at the time. That I was able to stay for almost a year was a small miracle. I finally was very politely invited to leave, but by the same Portuguese security police, but actually I'm amazed that I was able to stay as long as I did, and mainly it was because I was a girl, I was young, I was, insignificant, because some major anthropologists like Charles Wagley and Marvin Harris had tried to get into Cape Verde with no success. They were much too well known, I think. So to go on and talk a little more about life as I saw it in Cape Verde and as Cabral observed it, his description of the Cape Verdean social system corresponds very closely to what I saw in his book. Well, I have the French version, Unity and Struggle, Unité et Lutte, and the Arm of Theory. The small class of large property owners, the large class of renters and sharecroppers, and then the very small petty bourgeoisie concentrated in the two cities of the archipelago, Mindelo and Praia. And his insistence on the revolutionary potential of the petty bourgeoisie has a lot of resonance with my experience. He saw it as the part of Cape Verdean society that was caught in the middle, so to speak, and confronted on a daily basis by colonial prejudices and the contradictions between colonial rhetoric, Cape Verde was Portugal, and the reality, Cape Verdeans were a subject people whose loyalties were always suspect. And he, at the same time, saw individuals not as just creatures of their class, but also as capable of reacting to and acting on the forces that shape class structure and mentality. And so, unlike a kind of mechanistic Marxism, his thought leaves a great deal of space for what we're calling agency these days. His petty bourgeoisie, the school teachers, the minor bureaucrats, the agronomists like him, the doctors, lawyers, and so on, was in Cape Verde also the sector of the population most likely to be Protestant. And in the early 70s, about 10% of the population was Protestant. Most were members of the Nazarene Church, or few Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses. Protestant churches were one of the rare structured groups that were allowed to exist outside the Catholic church-state monolith, and which, like things like Portuguese youth modeled on Hitler Youth and so on. So the Church of the Nazarene was about the only alternative community life. When we talk about civil society these days, you know, it was so controlled. It was even hard for me to find informants, you know, because there were very few situations where people could gather and have leisure, privacy, and so on. So it's not surprising that from time to time Protestants were indiscriminately rounded up once the revolution began, and this had stuck in the memory of people that I was meeting. Such repression rendered all the more acute the ambivalence of many Protestants toward the colonial regime, and it was in fact mainly through the help of the Protestant community. I myself am from a very Catholic background, but in Cape Verde it was the Protestant and Protestant clergy, people in the state bureaucracy, who helped me carry out some more delicate aspects of my research. Some of the ministers in particular gave me a lot of help. And so Cabral says in one place that the germ of protest is situated in the cultural fact, and this petty bourgeoisie being so caught in between, and yet still in touch with the culture of peasants and the urban poor was very interesting. But also this popular culture I want to mention for a minute. There were many things in Cape Verde at the time that were a little hard to observe because they were secretive, they were covert, they were carried out far from the eyes of the security police and so on, and of course outside of the cities. But there were religious customs, dances, music, even drumming, you know, by that point was largely outlawed. So anything seen as African at that time was very much repressed, but still surviving covertly, and of course fascinating to me as an anthropologist. And many of these celebrations involved a lot of social critique. Anthropologists always argue about, are these things just a safety valve, or do they have real revolutionary potential? But they expressed things that were not socially visible at the time, for the most part. And so Cape Verdean popular culture exhibited many germs of protests, and many songs that were invented for these occasions and so on. And also, I have to talk about language, because in the Cape Verdean context, the Criollo language was used as a mode of resistance. It was outlawed, of course, in public spaces, in government spaces, and so on. But bilinguals who used code switching from Portuguese to Criollo all the time to include and exclude whom they wished. And so at the time, there was all this repression of Cape Verdean popular culture, but by doing so, we saw the contradictions of this regime, which was, in a sense, affirming its potential as a vehicle of resistance. After independence, I was amazed to see a dance that's at the time considered very African, called Kanizat, that was very repressed at the time I was there and very hard to observe, but I managed to in outlying rural localities of Fogo. But after independence, this emerged full-blown. Drums were used at every possible occasion, including birthday parties, and so on. So there was this kind of cultural explosion afterwards. But while I was there, it was a chance for me to see that things were not all that they seemed. And then if we come to the issue of national culture, for Cabral, even some of the colonial legacy could be incorporated into the new national culture, rather like Svetlana Todorov, who talks about the uses of memory and the exemplary use, using painful experience to perceive and fight against other instances of oppression and so on. And in his notion of building national culture, and while converging to a common stream of values for an anthropologist, especially one living in Quebec, this is a very interesting idea. And he promoted a non-ethnic vision of national culture. And in Cape Verde, although it looks very homogeneous from the outside, within the society, there are differences that are acutely felt locally from one island to another, between Barlavento, Sotavento, the different sections of the archipelago. And so the issue of building a national culture in an insular society is a very interesting one. Back also on the language, well, language issues in Cape Verde are very interesting, but Creole has gained a great deal of stature since independence. However, in Guinea-Bissau, Creole is a colonial language, basically. And so it's one of those interesting issues where this language, which for Cape Verdeans was a means of resistance, in the Guinea-Bissau context was a language used to colonize. Because Cape Verdeans, rather like people from Martinique and Guadeloupe in the French colonial system, Cape Verdeans were, the petty bourgeoisie again, were often the agents of Portuguese colonialism in continental Africa. But in this notion of national culture, we see how Cabral looks at culture as processual, and also the question of agency in culture. Finally, in his thinking on culture, besides its processual aspect, the issue of agency, Cabral often talked about universal culture. And it's interesting that just now anthropologists are starting to talk about culture as a pan-human achievement. And we now have places that are recognized as part of the human heritage and not just national heritage. It's increasingly seen as related to place, but separate from place, separable from place. And today, anthropologists are having to look at cultural convergence for many things, talking about bioethics and things like that. For anthropologists, we're having to get out of cultural particularism and look at, we might say, limited universals, at least. So that's another aspect of Cabral's thinking that I think has some contemporary resonance. And at the same time, he emphasized that the rights of a particular people to their particular culture and history are universal, somewhat paradoxically speaking. And to some degrees, his thinking has a lot of echoes of issues of human rights, what the French call the droits de l'homme. And although his education was basically Portuguese, Portuguese learning was very much influenced by France. And Portuguese who studied, went to, for higher studies, were often kind of subtly put down as Frenchified, but the French influences are kind of clear in his thinking. How much more time do I have?
9 minutes.
11 minutes? 9 minutes. Okay, good. So it's a little hard to judge how much I should go into and so on. For Cape Verdeans, the whole notion of Cape Verdean identity is, it was a hot theme when I first started doing research. It's debated today by Cape Verdean Americans ad infinitum. And what I finally realized over the years in working in other contexts was that the fluidity of identity that Cabral's vision takes account of is actually more the norm than the overly stable, unquestioned identities that were pretty much the prevalent notion when I first started studying these things. But when he approaches identity and dignity together, Cabral underscores the connection between concepts and moral issues. And this is a theme that I think is most pressing for social sciences today. And for him, as he saw it, the question of racism lies at the very heart of the relation between identity and dignity. Finally, in this day and age, anthropologists are beginning to accept, I think, that scientific concepts have a moral dimension. And I always think of James Clifford's article on diaspora, which is a model of, but also a model for. And I think that finally we are moving to some of this, and this double aspect of Cabral's thought as being based on observation, but also being concerned with what should be built, I think is extremely contemporary. Why is it that so much of his thinking surpasses the context that gave rise to it? I think it's part of it is he's profoundly dialectical and not mechanical, seeing society's cultures as ever in process. And also, to the extent that he was Marxist or influenced by Marxism, he was also profoundly humanistic and concerned with universals, and not in the Eurocentric idea of universals of dead white males, but universal that's always in process and not fixed either. And so we see that his thinking has this built-in flexibility, which is, I think, very, very suitable for our era. And that what is considered universal is always emergent and will come to be defined through the very process of liberation of those who have been silent, oppressed, and unheard. Now, looking at the issue of why he's so misjudged, that's about all I can manage on this particular question. Why Cabral so misjudged the potential for unity between Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau? It is, as Pablo just said, he did not expect the petty bourgeoisie to just commit suicide. But the tenacity of the petty bourgeoisie, the existing petty bourgeoisie, was perhaps underestimated. And also, Cape Verde is more and more urbanized. Today, over half the population, I think about at least 60%, a little more than 60%, lives in cities, basically. And this, if anything, is supportive of the petty bourgeoisie, which will tend to be concentrated there. But that's just one factor. When some years after my first field work, I wrote an article for a book edited by Robin Cohen about Cape Verde. It was called Cape Verde Survival Without Self-Sufficiency. And by that point, the early 80s, Cape Verde was well on its way to getting on its feet and using international aid in a very pragmatic and really smart way, not going for overly big projects, going for more smaller level things suitable to the Cape Verdean context. And in some ways, Cabral's vision kind of worked out for Cape Verde, but not so well for Guinea-Bissau, and not at all for the union between Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau. And although this class, and especially, as I mentioned, for me, the Protestant network was really my way in to getting some real information about some things in the conditions of colonialism. But when you look, for example, at the language issues, I mentioned the paradox of Criollo as a means of resistance and as an arm of colonialism, depending on the context. In post-colonial Cape Verde, one of the things I noticed was that the new elite, the ministers and so on that I were meeting, when they learned I was from Montreal and we started speaking French, they were so happy to speak French. You know, they're a very Europe-oriented elite. And Cape Verde had the advantage of having a huge amount of cultural capital, you know, in the form of educated immigrants or, you know, exiles that were able to come back, some of whom had been more involved in revolution than others. But the knowledge of Guinea-Bissau in Cape Verde, or let's say the ignorance, is almost without limit. You know, the personal experience of Cape Verdeans of Guinea-Bissau was nil, except for the few who had been there in basically a colonial role, and for the sort of the popular classes, Guinea-Bissau was looked at as a frightening place, as indeed the whole African continent was. But Guinea-Bissau happened to be a part that at least they had heard of. And so this, the cultural distance between Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau was enormous. It was already a huge task to build a national culture in Cape Verde. To build a national culture in Guinea-Bissau is a different kind of task because there's all the ethnic issues. It's a totally different reality, a reality that was totally unknown to most Cape Verdeans. And I think that all of these factors, and finally the fact that their economic conditions were so different and their economic problems were so different, all of these militated against any union lasting. There was kind of lip service being paid to it through the 70s, and I suppose some people still really believed in it in PAIGC circles, but after 1980, on the Cape Verdean side at least, it was pretty disillusioned, and from there on it seemed to fall by the wayside. But I think that possibly Cabral, because he himself bridged the two cultures, perhaps he overestimated how possible it was for others. Thank you. I think I'll stop there.
Good morning. My text, or rather this text, I should say, addresses the final question from the workshop, and let me perhaps quote it again, which is how can Cabral's revolutionary thought in praxis assist us in understanding the premises and perils of African nationalism? I twisted slightly and broaden it, if I may, to not only talk about African nationalism per se, but nationalism and national politics globally, since my perspective on Cabral is perhaps nuanced somewhat differently. And so this text then is split into essentially 4 sections. The first section is to look at Cabral under the scholarly gaze up to this point, and then to really track down the genealogy of his writings and his thoughts and the dynamics in between that. And then perhaps to look at how he viewed culture, identity, and self-determination. And then finally to provide a conclusive context in so far as how his thoughts and ideas could be applied today. And so that's the broad outline. Several works to date assess Amilcar Cabral, Luso-Africa's preeminent nationalist and thinker, who spearheaded the fight to oust Portugal from Guinea-Bissau and the adjacent islands of Cape Verde. Some embed him in the context of this fight. A handful focuses on him almost exclusively, and a few discuss his political ideas. The perspectives they offer vary. One set sees him as a Marxist-Leninist, a hyphenated Gramscian Marxist, Africa's answers to Lenin, a revolutionary par excellence, or as good as Karl Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, and others who, quote, left as a legacy of revolutionary experience, unquote. Others, persuaded by lack of reference to doctrinal tracts in his texts, seem less convinced on occasions, of his portrayal as a hardcore ideologue, and find him to be a Marxist in method, but not ideology. In other words, a socialist, a revolutionary democrat, perhaps. The resultant portrait, however, leaves Cabral fundamentally a Marxist, but with a perspective exogenous to him unchallenged. Today, Cabral is a fractal refraction of 20 or more characteristics, each competing with the other for attributive supremacy in the Marxist canon. There is evidence to suggest that Marx and Mao tussled together in a sack to really claim him. May well have influenced him. But Cabral was far more complex than that. Almost all scholars in the field acknowledge this to a degree. One or two scholars even go so far as to construct him as Africa's philosopher king, the supreme educator of the wisest sense, I'm now quoting all this, or an empiricist devoid of ideological dogmatism and rigidity. Making this type of assessment in the context of revolutionary thought. One author elects to project him as a humanist, and I shan't actually quote publicly who it is, a pragmatist, an undaunted optimist to the end, a dominant, friendly, tolerant, charismatic leader, a teacher, while another, claimed to have been a unifier of people. Those that see Cabral as a complex personality above or outside doctrinal Marxism do so as part of a discourse on the armed struggle and the diplomacy for liberation that accompanied it. These scholars focus on a specific area of his life pertinent to a given discourse. Such works attempt to encapsulate Cabral in a broader context, but are seen by critics as partially successful in capturing Cabral's essential core. These works are subsequently determined as having failed to see him outside hagiography, something that you outlined. Cabral himself saw his leadership to fight for liberty as part of a larger whole. To quote, "Nobody is indispensable," Cabral said of himself. "An achievement is worthwhile to the extent that it is an achievement of many, even if one pair of hands is taken away," rather an Hegelian approach to life. Placing aside Cabral's Marxist influence on him, it could be argued that Cabral was Cabral, a complex meta-racial African, and as such, a closer look at his life and work suggests a triad governed him: external inputs, internal reflection, and reflexive action. Viewed this way, he emerges deservedly complex, intact, and with a core of his own rather than that of a Marxist derivative. No one has yet produced a full-scale, stand-alone, and up-to-date biography on him per se, much to everyone's regret. Chabal's 1980 monograph on Cabral and Chilcote's latest opus bibliographicae notwithstanding, Paulo Freire perhaps comes nearest to the jugular, as does Mario de Andrade, describing Cabral holistically, from inside out as it were, a dialectically unified personality, a public figure internally balanced between words and actions. Indeed, Cabral saw himself this way, as an ordinary man who lived life intensely and drew from it experiences that gave him direction. His reflections informed his actions, springing forth in the end analytical responses calibrated for praxis. Cabral was immensely creative in this way, and the balance between words and actions informed his strategies throughout his both professional, personal, and political life and career. To understand the context of his experience, Cabral reflected over empirical evidence, explored viewpoints in normative discourses, and engaged in vigorous discussions and discords with friends, and these discords were pretty feisty, particularly in Lisbon and Cape Verde, with friends living a colonial reality similar to his, all of which cumulatively neutralized the toxicity of the colonial experience, mining him within. The colonial experiences, structural, environmental, racial, and creative in nature, had brought Cabral to witness poverty, drought catalyzed by asymmetric colonial agricultural policies, economic marginality, racial profiling and preferences in the Bissau civil service, abuse of the rule of law in the colonies and in the metropolis, and restrictions on creative liberties in the media and the performing arts. Furthermore, travels on professional assignments to Angola had brought him face to face with the inner workings of plantation economy, as did his travels and discussions with political activists, party officials, and networking contacts in Egypt, Guinea-Conakry, Morocco, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and the list absolutely continues. In Guinea itself, he and his team, we have already made references to it, he traveled over 60,000 kilometers, visiting 2,248 hamlets to produce a 200-page commission report evaluating the colony's agricultural demography. These experiences and encounters, reflections, and normative inputs shaped him and his thinking, which subsequently informed his strategy for national liberation from Portuguese colonialism. Cabral thus rose above his condition to serve a normative future, a call befitting the greater good above the need of the personal and the present. So what about his thoughts and his writings in context? One of Cabral's first most significant non-technical text analyzed the social structures under colonialism, which has been referred to. It was published as a seminal paper in August 1964. Cabral drew inspirations for this narrative from two sources: archival research of Portuguese colonial documents in Lisbon during his student days in the 1940s and 50s, and studies in demographic agronomy, which I mentioned earlier, undertaken during his stay in Bissau prior to the formation of his binationalist movement. Warriors at Work, a monograph on the liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, give a detailed breakdown of Cabral's thinking here. And it's not, by the way, the complete record, I might add. This structural analysis highlighted Guinea-Bissau to be a tapestry of 18 social fragments, segments of fragmented dependencies, serving sectors of the colonial demography in a complex structural web. Each segment was assessed according to either its position and privilege under colonialism, or the degree of depletion of its sovereign identity, or a mixture of both. At the extreme, therefore, a segment was seen, or could be seen, as having been denuded of a will to create transformational change, while another segment was identified as nihilistic, unable to entertain change for a future without colonialism. The sector, according to him, was unwilling to engage in revolutionary actions, driven by a goal for self-determination, or, as he called it, an individual's mastery over nature. nature here signifying the status quo. This analysis ultimately became a blueprint for action to oust Portugal from Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde 2 years later during the mobilization drive, which, by the way, also drew on his critical readings of literary works, poetry and drama, and his experiences as a former radio talk show host in Cabo Verde. Again, a detailed narrative on how this campaign was executed and how it entailed performance-based canvassing are to be found documented in broad strokes in Patrick Chabal's seminal work and also in Warrior's Edge work, though the latter engages in a more Cartesian perspective, sticking very close to culture of evidence while eschewing generalities lacking a documentable specificity, something that you evidently caught very quickly. In 1966, Cabral finally completed constructing a theoretical template for liberation, which distilled what he saw, what he learned in the field, as it were, and what he could draw from it. He reveals this template in the summer of that year during his visits to Cuba on the formation of the Tricontinental, a Third World Solidarity organization. The meeting was very crucial because it provided him and his organization the opportunity to solicit material support for much needed for the armed struggle. Cabral sought to attract donors in two ways. This is really where he is an intellectual and a praxeological liberator. By demonstrating the strength behind the movement and by conveying the visionary caliber of his leadership. To this end, he delivered a tightly woven presentation suggesting his movements to be solidly grounded in sound theory. This presentation, which has now been quoted, namely The Weapon of Theory, proved to be the first of several public texts outlining his thinking on the social construction of identity, culture, and liberty. 3 years later, Cabral deployed the Weapon of Theory framework to analyze the crisis that his binationalist movement faced. The analysis engendered a seldom examined 5-part study on political to economic, armed, and cultural types of resistance. Alas, those mimeographed documents are now extinct. It was this analysis that helped him and his movement tackle internal dissent and external challenges related to the armed struggle against Portugal. Discourses in this 5-part study ultimately went on to inform 2 of his subsequent and what later proved to be final texts on identity, culture, and national liberation. One text, National Liberation and Culture, was delivered on the 20th of February 1970 at Syracuse University, a year after Eduardo Mondlane's assassination. That same very text appeared in Wolfer's critical 1980 edition of Unity and Struggle. The last text, The Role of Culture in Liberation Struggle, was crafted during the summer of 1972, 6 months before his own assassination on January the 20th, 1973, at 10:30 at night outside his home in a VW van. In his pocket were a letter he was writing to his daughter, a fountain pen, and a pair of reading glasses. I can tell you what he was wearing too. The Syracuse text proved challenging to deliver. Up to this point, Cabral, like other Luso-African nationalist leaders, was unwelcome in the United States. Cabral had visited the US once before in New York in 1962 to convince the United Nations Fourth Committee to recognize the binationalist movement he was leading. The succeeding 8 years, Cabral failed to gain entry into the United States, largely because the latter's NATO-based alliance with Lisbon helped the US with its Vietnam-focused logistic needs for military facilities and bases in the Azores Islands. In 1970, however, things changed. A few months before the event at Syracuse, the Vatican, which was in the throes of Vatican II, and which was headed by Pope John the 23rd, recognized Cabral's movement and those led by the fellow Luso-Africans fighting for self-determination in Angola and Mozambique. Thereafter, American position on Lusophone nationalism softened. Cabral was not only granted entry to deliver the memorial lecture, but was subsequently invited to speak to the Senate hearings on Portuguese colonies. The writing was almost on the wall. Put differently, both Cabral and the text were received very well, given the circumstantial trajectory of this entry into the empire on the other side of Portugal. Now, how did he view culture, identity, and self-determination? To this point, I provided you with the genealogy and the praxis. Cabral saw culture as a process of individual and social consciousness, resulting in a dynamic synthesis. The synthesis engaged, to quote, the material and spiritual historical reality of a society or human group as a discourse, and then quote again, between man and nature, as well as among men and among the social classes or sectors. Needless to add, he is using here, not being gender biased, but using generically speaking, given the built-in challenge. Identity, on the other hand, according to Cabral, was the affirmation or negation of characteristics by an individual along the biosocial historical continuum, unquote. For Cabral, then, identity was an informed choice with which to affirm or negate a given culture. That choice was arrived at or catalyzed through a creative force. Education, in its broadest sense, was one such creative force, as were the fine arts and performance and radio theatre. As such, this creative force played a clear, multi-dimensional role as a rectifier of deficiencies, as a builder of capacity for choosing identity, and as a tool for empirical, existential, and iterative self-realignment. How am I doing on time?
8 minutes.
Sorry?
8 minutes.
Whether catalyzed by forces outside one or from within, public fora education was a transdisciplinary key to progress. His own early multidisciplinary forays into poetry, dramaturgy, mass media, arts and communication, and the natural sciences, agronomy inclusive, were a testament to his perspective, as was his inclination to use his colonized life as a learning process. Lifelong learning, therefore, transcended disciplinary bounds for creative self-growth. When fed by external reflexive forces, and processed internally through iterative analysis, a white could thus claim to be an African by choice, as could a black elect to be a European, in theory, that is. In practice, however, colonialism complicated the prospect of blacks as Europeans and bugged it all out. Cabral, therefore, saw colonialism as a complex shape-shifter, not a zero-sum entity dominantly developing Europe, as Walter Rodney's text would suggest. In its totality, colonialism was a force of cultural occupation in Africa. In contact with the local population, colonialism pushed, tugged, and pulled the social fabric of the subjugated, shaking it loose while driving the most susceptible to socioeconomic extremities, and the least vulnerable and the fewer in number towards a cultural and socioeconomic collusive supremacy in cahoots with the empire. Assimilation policies proved singularly effective in furthering imperial interests here. They formalized entries for the assimilated into the upper margins of society, suggests Cabral, by using literacy pre-qualifiers. Colonialism therefore targeted such individuals for colonial agency, thereby inducing what we in colonies call reinseamento, alienation through upheaval. Ultimately, with this process in place, the assimilated assumed a colonized or colonialized identity, serving Portugal as cultural occupationists. By very definition, such individuals lived both the margins of society, at the margins of their own culture, and at the fringe of the dominant colonial culture. That impact on the majority was even more pernicious, divisive, and variegated. It is here that a return to the source must play a role in self-determination, says Cabral, a first step in their struggle to decolonize. To find themselves from within, and in the context of their own culture, such individuals, according to Cabral, must return to the source. They must re-Africanize, build a series of biosocial and historical matrices on which to begin a process of self-validation and, by linear extension, wean off colonialism. Of course, there is nothing to prevent such individuals from staying put. But to do so, is to continue the validation of a culturally occupying force, which in turn was anti-liberation, an irrational choice outside self-determining history. Were such individuals to commit, as it were, cultural suicide, however, they were not bound to construct a matrix whence they originally sprang. And that's an important point Cabral makes. They could turn to alternative sources of non-imperial culture or graft a composite. In his own case, he elected to re-Africanize, reclaiming his African roots while dermally retaining his Cape Verdean socio-biological nativity. In short, he became a binationalist. It is not surprising that Cabral came to these sets of heuristic conclusions for his own process of self-determination. In retrospect, it is clear that this process was largely dictated by two sets of experiences which I mentioned earlier in the text. The first then sprang largely from his colonial encounters, before, during, and immediately after his university days in Lisbon, before his arrival in Guinea-Bissau. And the second set emerged from his lived-in experience as a fighter leading the struggle against Portuguese colonialism. Further, it is important to point out that Cabral here is not advocating a process of individuation as used in Jungian psychology. No. He is asking that the rediscovery of the new self be part of a larger social and cultural collective. He saw individualism as a scab, residually stripping native culture of its dignity. In a sense, Cabral is therefore at odds with Senghor's idea of a validation of a dominant European cultural, colonial culture, particularly one that encourages subsumption of African social cultural realities. Once reconstructed, Cabral envisioned such de-assimilated elites to catapult to leading the party. Even here, Cabral notes with caution, this sudden rise to power was fraught with peril for the party and ultimately the nation. One such peril was nepotism. Basil Davidson, in his earlier work, chose to call it mountain-topism, that is to say, a term used by the Chinese under Mao's leadership to denote corruption and graft. Cabral was astute to recognize this as a possibility within his party, and for good reason. After all, these assimilated leaders had in the past abused power as enablers of cultural occupation under Portuguese colonialism. I'm off. Oh, 2 more minutes. Well, that's fine. He therefore, I should now go into a kind of a car advertising note. He was therefore right to suspect that this trend would infect his own party. And how did he then actually sort of resolved it? He actually resolved it through a series of vigilant and public education designed to defeat sectarianism with service for the greater good. Cabral here was using his own version of mini conférence nationale, a magnavox populi, if you like, a formalized institution, a sacred space in which the people as no one negotiated conflicts and settled pressing issues of national concern as a lived-in experience under an ideological banner. The conclusive context. Can Cabral's thoughts and actions address the challenges we face in contemporary national politics in Africa and beyond? As stated in the text, Cabral's culture was a relational matrix governing humans in their natural context, a matrix openly adaptive towards an objective. Identity was an act of volition, docking one's consciousness to a culture of choice driven for a purpose. Taken together, culture and identity, when operationalized this way, drove the dynamics of self-liberation forward, and also national liberation. Of course, when such dynamics derailed from its purpose, public fora or self-determination conferences ensured that both culture and identity reoriented anew towards the struggle for liberty and self-determination. This task of reorientation was achieved by negotiating conflicts collectively in the Claude Fortean sense of the word. Allow me just then about one sentence, or two, or a paragraph. Put differently, the ailments festering contemporary nationalism in Africa and in general globally could benefit a great deal from Cabral's ideas as praxis. His concept of culture as a malleable force for national consciousness and national building could prove immensely popular in resolving crises in ideology, address atomized partisanship, and tackle conflict festered by identity politics, race, and warring cultures. In advocacy to dock identity to culture as a Cartesian choice could facilitate greater consciousness for an all-inclusive social pluralism, a pluralism that celebrates diversity and acceptance. Such a stance, therefore, would render identity as an act of choice and not an inheritance dictated by accidents of birth reinforced by divisive social conditioning. His framework of national conference could well address broader national crises threatening the very fabric of constitutional politics in a global world. In a few words, then, Cabral is indeed relevant in the world in which we presently live.
Good morning to everybody, and I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference for putting this conference, this workshop together, and having me here. So I can't promise to be as eloquent as the other presentation, and particularly the last presentation. A hard act to follow. I was saying that I can't promise to be as eloquent as the presentations that preceded me, and particularly the last one. But I want to talk a bit about Cabral within the tradition of Pan-Africanism that includes particularly Walter Rodney. And I'm going to begin doing that by talking about a friend, somebody named Abbott, who's from Senegal. He's a friend who now lives in Toronto, but originally lived in Montreal. And a conversation we had sometime in the late 1990s, where I was listening to some recordings of speeches given by C.L.R. James in Montreal, which eventually became part of this book that was mentioned, You Don't Play with Revolution. And in one of these speeches, which is not in the book, called Policy and Program for Development in Africa, I think maybe the title itself suggests what might have been wrong with that particular speech, or why I didn't make it in the book. James very uncharacteristically puts forward this analysis of development in the African context, which suggests that aid programs, even mentions Oxfam, I think, will be part of this process of African development, which seemed to be a very big departure from his usual analysis on social transformation in the Caribbean, in the African context, and other parts of the world. So it wasn't his usual nuanced, complex, kind of sophisticated analysis. And I shared this lecture with Abbott. Abbott, by the way, somebody who was very much influenced by Cabral as a member of the group called the Group for Liberation, the Group for the Initiative for the Liberation of Africa, which has a brand, so to speak, here in Toronto. But it started out in Montreal. It's done a lot of work around Thomas Sankara and other kinds of events and activities. Ahmed was quick to very incisively and clearly point out in a very direct way that James was essentially applying Western and, in this case, Western/West Indian constructs and sensibilities to an African continent to which, even though he had been very close with people like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, or perhaps as a result of being closely associated with them in the 1940s in England, he was not very familiar with the kind of cultural, social terrain of the African continent in the way that somebody like Cabral would have been. Right now, of course, James was part of a long tradition of Caribbean and diasporic Pan-Africans, right, who saw the West Indian Road or the Caribbean Road to liberation through the African continent. Even though he didn't participate in the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester, he had played a part in the events that led up to that event. And as I said, was part of this long tradition, which though post-1945, it began to sort of change, and many Caribbean political figures began to sort of channel or rechannel their energies directly towards the Caribbean. But there were many exceptions. Frantz Fanon was one, and Walter Rodney was another. And I want to talk a bit about Walter Rodney in relation to Cabral through one of Walter Rodney's books, A History of the Upper Guinea Coast. An important book by Walter Rodney, but probably his least appreciated and least studied. Okay, so I'm going to read from this point onwards. Okay. In A History of the Upper Guinea Coast, 1945 to 1800, Walter Rodney examines trade and social relations between primarily Portuguese merchants and West Africans. As we learn from him in Walter Rodney Speaks, the book, History of Upper Guinea Coast, represents an effort to bring to bear a class-based analysis on the history of slavery and colonization in Africa. A history of Upper Guinea Coast is centered on the sociology and economic history of the West African coast prior to and during the slave trade, and the impact of the trade on African societies. And in his painstakingly researched study, Rodney provides the reader with insight into the inner workings and dynamics of West African societies during this period, and raises similar issues to those raised by Amilcar Cabral in the 20th century, or in relation to the 20th century, or 20th century Guinea-Bissau under Portuguese rule. In many ways, Cabral's analysis of Guinea-Bissau makes explicit in the 20th century context what Rodney projects in his analysis of 16th to 19th century West African history. Walter Rodney was a close associate of James. He read most of James's classic works and was part of a study group that included a number of young Caribbean left political figures in the 1960s in London, along with Selma James. He was part of the study group while he was working on his PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And it was that PhD which eventually became a thesis that became a history of the Upper Guinea Coast. As I mentioned, it's probably his least one of his major works. As I say here, it would be fair to say that it has generally been ignored by Rodney scholars, particularly American scholars, and that's coming from Rodney himself, which might have something to do with the Marxian class-based analysis or its class-based approach, and for different reasons, or different and similar reasons, by self-described Pan-Africanist scholars. The book is unique for its nuanced description of the relationship between Africans and Europeans, a relationship that began on a relatively equal footing according to Rodney, but then deteriorated into one of exploitation and servitude. It also illustrates the role of Africans in the slave trade, but without diminishing the role played by Europeans. And that's an interesting point to maybe come back to. Rodney applies a Marxian analysis to distinguish between the aims and aspirations of the African ruling class on the one hand, and the majority population on the other. Somewhat empirical in its approach, the book details the way in which the African elite were both used and manipulated by Europeans during the slave trade, and the way in which these same elites also consciously manipulated their European counterparts in order to profit from the enslavement of other Africans. Rodney never loses sight of the fact that it was Europeans who orchestrated and the primary beneficiaries of the slave trade, yet referring to the existence of social classes in the Upper Guinea Coast and the phenomenon of slavery, Rodney informs us, and this is a quote, that kings were just as likely to rob their own people as to attack their neighbors. He also suggests, quote, it could scarcely have been a simple coincidence that both the Jola and the Balantas, who produced the least number of slaves, either by raiding or by preying upon other groups, were the very tribes with an amorphous state structure, from which a well-defined ruling class was absent. Probably see some of the parallels with. I'll come back to that. Rodney also suggests that tribal divisions were not then the most important, and that when the line of demarcation is clearly drawn between the agents and victims of slaving, as it was carried out in the Upper Guinea Coast, that line coincides with the distinction between the privileged and the unprivileged in the society as a whole. End of quote. And then he says the Atlantic slave trade was deliberately selective in its impact on the society of the Upper Guinea Coast, and according to Rodney, with the ruling class projecting itself while helping Europeans to exploit the common people. This of course was a widespread pattern of modern neocolonialism. So he's writing about slavery, right? But he's also projecting into the present by talking about neocolonialism. So two major points stand out in Rodney's argument, points that illustrate his unique traits as a historian and Pan-African figure. First, Rodney did not hesitate to implicate African rulers in the African slave trade, a critique that he would later extend to contemporary African and Caribbean rulers. Yet he did so without absolving Europe of its pivotal role in the trade of Africans, and without overlooking the fact that those who most benefited from the trade were Europeans and their descendants. Hence his mention of neocolonialism, which suggests that the book was animated by political and economic developments in post-colonial Africa. He was writing in the 1960s. Secondly, in identifying class differences in Africa, Rodney was able to separate the, quote, common people from the elite who acted in accordance with their own interests, as opposed to those of the entire population, or the majority population. This, too, is an analysis that he would draw upon in his assessments of contemporary African and Caribbean developments in his later work. Rodney's description of the Jola and Balanta is reminiscent of the writing of Amilcar Cabral. While Rodney's analysis was informed by historical research, Cabral was an agronomist by training who surveyed the rural areas of Guinea-Bissau, as you know, and in the process drew conclusions about the social structures of diverse ethnic groups within the region. His intimate and very detailed understanding of the territory of Guinea-Bissau, coupled with his penetrating analysis, brought him to conclusions that complement those of Rodney. And this is a quote from Cabral. In societies with a horizontal structure, which is akin to the amorphous structure that Rodney refers to, like the Balanta society, for example, the distribution of cultural levels is more or less uniform, variations being linked solely to individual characteristics and to age groups. In the societies with a vertical or more hierarchical structure, like that of the Fula, there are important variations from top to bottom on the social pyramid. This shows the close connections between the cultural factor and the economic factor, and also explains the differences in the overall sectoral behavior of these two ethnic groups towards the liberation movement. Moreover, the class character, according to Cabral, is more noticeable in the behavior of privileged groups in the rural environment, notably where ethnic groups with a vertical structure are concerned, where nevertheless the influences of assimilation or cultural alienation are nil or virtually nil. This is the case of the Fula ruling class, for example, under colonial domination, adds Cabral, and the political authority of this class, traditional chiefs, noble families, religious leaders, etc., is purely nominal, and the mass of the people are aware of the fact that the real authority lies with and is wielded by colonial administrators. However, he says, and this is part of his complex analysis and kind of unraveling of class, however, the ruling class retains in essence its cultural authority over the mass of the people in the group, with very important implications. And he goes on to say that the colonial authorities, knowing this reality, installs chiefs whom it trusts and who are more or less accepted by the population, gives them various material privileges, including education for their eldest children, creates chiefdoms where they did not exist, establishes and develops cordial relations with religious leaders. This system, he says, by means of the repressive organs of the colonial administration, ensures the economic and social privileges of the ruling class in relation to the mass of the people. Though, he says, this does not remove the possibility among the ruling classes that there may be individuals or groups of individuals who join the liberation movement. I think, as Deirdre says, quoting Cabral, commit class suicide. Perhaps like no other African political leader, Cabral spoke frankly, openly, and clearly about class and the dangers of the ruling elite, and the dangers and potential of them betraying the aspirations of their people. But in doing so, it probably encourages us to think about this notion of what betrayal means. So what does it mean to betray your people on the one hand, and on the other hand, what is being said is that those elites, as complex as his analysis of who these elites are, is actually representing their own interests, which is exactly what Walter Rodney is saying. So in that sense, is it actually betrayal, or them actually acting and working in according with their class interests? Which I think is implicit in the point that both Walter Rodney and Cabral are making. Like Rodney and Fanon, Cabral understood the importance of class differentiation in the shaping of African societies, and was fully conscious of the role of these differences, of the role that these differences could play in post-colonial Africa. But unlike Fanon's modernism, and to a greater extent like Rodney, Cabral's analysis was rooted in an understanding of the peculiar features of Guinea-Bissau, which he then, as theorists do, generalized in his analysis of Africa, but without overgeneralizing. So generalizing, but without overgeneralizing. Really? I should have gone back to some of the stuff that I skipped. It's remarkable that Cabral's work is not more widely acknowledged and studied in greater detail. Certainly, without a doubt, he was one of the 20th century's brilliant political minds and theorists, and someone, perhaps more than any other single individual, lent clarity to the complex interplay of forces that defines the African continent. Cabral was also one of the major influences on Walter Rodney's political life, and it's not coincidental or surprising that through different means, one through historical research, and one through his research and work as an agronomist, they would come to similar conclusions about the nature of class struggle in Africa. In writing about the Atlantic slave trade at this early stage in his political life, Rodney was conscious of the prevailing socio-economic climate in Africa and the Caribbean, and used history as a means of contextualizing and assessing contemporary events in much the same way that Cabral arrived at theoretical and political conclusions through his intimate understanding of the social economic structures of Guinea-Bissau societies. There's much that we can learn from both in terms of their analysis, as we attempt to disentangle the dynamics of struggle in the African continent, its diaspora, and other social and political contexts around the world. So, yeah, I'm actually finished way ahead of time.
Actually, no, it was 8 minutes ago.
Okay. All right, well, I'm done. So.